Hello there, and welcome to another episode of a Candid Conversation with Adam Lopez. I'm your host, Adam, and today we have a very special episode. It's with the American Cancer Society, specifically talking about African American perspectives on diversity in science as it relates to cancer. And I have two very special guests this afternoon, wherever you may be listening and watching. I have with us Tracie Kimbrough. She's a cancer survivor and also a volunteer for Reach to Recovery, American Cancer Society, longtime ACS spokesperson, and making strides against breast cancer ambassador. She worked for the State of California Employee Development Department. Welcome, Tracie, to the show.
Hi, everyone.
Also, we have with us Dr. Goffney. He's a surgical oncologist in Long Beach, California. And Dr. Goffney, I have a whole 2 pages of a lot of things that you do, a lot of titles, a lot of involvement. But the reality is that you were one of the 27 Americans honored by the American Cancer Society with the prestigious St. George National Award in 2013. And you've just been a great advocate of ACS. Is that correct, sir?
That's correct. Thank you so much for having me.
Welcome to the program. It's a pleasure, number one, meeting you. I know Dr. Goffney, I met you in person before. Tracie, first time meeting you. But just so you know a little bit of background, my mother is a 2-time cancer survivor. So this is why this is very special to me. This is why it hits home to me. We just came back from Dallas from the summit, Dr. Goffney, where we met a bunch of different individuals, special, remarkable individuals who give back so much. But today we have a very special edition, a very special topic, sensitive topic discussion that we want to have, and it's around the African American perspective on diversity in science. And what I want to do, because it's African American History Month taking place, and I want to ask you both, and I'll start with you, Dr. Goffney, what are your thoughts on discussing diversity in science, whether it's past, present, or the future?
Well, thank you for that. I think trying to interest African Americans in science is probably no different from interesting any other a member of any other race to science. I think it has to come from having some initial interest in science.
Correct.
And that could happen in many different ways. You know, it may come from being exposed to someone in science as a young child, certainly early in your formative years. It may come from being exposed to some aspect of science at school. And so that means you have to have programs that are introducing various areas of this particular topic to students. It may come from having some success even in some scientific pursuit,
Correct.
Usually in school. This is true across the board. If you look at what any of us choose to do, it's usually through some type of activity early in life, or some type of exposure early in life that piques your interest or helps you to realize that you're good at something.
Yeah.
And so one of the problems I see, certainly for African Americans, is that you don't necessarily have exposure to the role models that are out there. And if you're in a school system that doesn't focus on science, doesn't pique an interest in math and science early on, then you don't have the tool set necessary to go on to really become a scientist of any merit down the line.
Yeah, well, I think you hit many good points that we can definitely elaborate on the conversation. But thank you for that knowledge. And I'm going to go to the second question, which is for Tracie. Tracie, so we understand you are a cancer survivor, and you're one of those miracles now that you can share your story. You can instill that hope in others. Which again, my mother is as well. But I have a very specific question for you. What was your experience as an African American providing or receiving cancer treatment? Were clinical trials involved at all?
Okay, so no, in my particular case, no clinical trials were involved because we made sure to catch it early. We knew that I was exceptionally high risk based on my family history. And we knew going in that I had the breast cancer gene. We knew I had a strong family history. So we were checking. My doctor was well aware, and my experience was very different than some people because I was fortunate enough that I had excellent health insurance, and so I didn't have to struggle to find treatment as much as some people. But even with that, even with amazing health insurance, there were still some issues. For instance, when I was referred to the surgeon, once we knew, my oncologist, Dr. Barstis was my oncologist, who's an incredible guy. And my sister also had battled cancer, and he was her oncologist as well. So we were fortunate to have that same doctor. So when he started noticing similarities, he was like, you know what, we need to test to see if you have the BRCA gene. But how often does that happen, where family members are going to the same doctor? That doesn't happen that often. So that was a lucky break for my sister and I. And I will never forget being referred to the surgeon. Of course, I'm terrified, obviously. They just told me I have cancer. And the only visual that I had for cancer was what I had witnessed my sister going through. That was with the chemo, the hair loss, the sickness, the debilitating weakness, all of that. And I'm thinking, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. Please don't let me have to do that. And so I was terrified. So when we went to my surgeon for the first surgical appointment, my sister went with me, and I will never forget it, because the surgeon was so cold and lacked any semblance of empathy.
Wow.
I thought to myself, if this is the person that I'm going to have to trust to cut on me. And he literally said to us, and thank God my sister had already gone through it and she was with me. Because, you know, first of all, when you go to see a doctor as a layperson, you tend to believe anything they tell you. We've all been conditioned for that authority dynamic.
That's right.
So you don't always question if the doctor says you need to cut off your left arm, even though you're thinking, I don't think I need that, but okay. And you let them do it, because that's the conditioning we've had our entire lives. And when you add in minorities and people of color, it steps it up a notch. The people in the white coats, they must know what they're talking about. They're so much smarter than I.
Right.
And so you go with it. And that's not always to your best. The doctor literally said to me, he drew a picture of how he was going to cut. And by the time he finished making lines, it looked like a tattoo, like a tic-tac-toe thing. Wow. And I was in tears. And I said, well, won't that leave a scar? The doctor literally said to me, oh, that's not my problem. That's your plastic surgeons to worry about. What? But it doesn't look like there's going to be anything left. Yeah. And he said, that's not my problem. And my sister, and I'm sitting there in shock and crying. Yeah. And my sister just looked at him and said, you know what? Just write us a referral. We want a breast specialist surgeon. Yeah. Just write us the referral. And the doctor literally said to us, oh, good. I hate doing these anyway.
Oh, jeez.
So, like, wait, what?
Yeah.
And this is with top tier, excellent health insurance. So, you know, that sticks out to me, because I was blessed. I had someone with me who knew the ins and outs, because she had already gone through it. And she knew to ask for a specialist. I had no idea that that was my right to ask for that. I didn't know. There's too many people who don't know what they can do. Yeah. And what they have a right to. Yeah. And sometimes they end up with subpar service. It may save their life, absolutely, but at what cost? Yeah. What quality of life do they have afterwards? Yeah. And that's important.
No, absolutely. And Tracie, thank you so much for getting so personal and sharing that experience. You know, number one, so sorry you have to go through that. And you touch a lot of different points, the financial aspect of it, the emotional roller coaster, the lack of empathy, the lack of resources. And you know what? I live in an area, I'm a community leader. I serve my civic duties in the city, in the county. And here it's predominant, underserved, underprivileged, illegal immigrants, field workers, agriculture workers. And one of the things that I realized immediately in navigating through this journey with my mother is the lack of or no educational platform, the lack of or no resources, the lack of proper insurance. So I'm thinking, if individuals who are going through a cancer situation or journey have the premium insurance, and and they have the good treatments, and they still have struggle with this. I can only imagine those individuals who do not have those benefits or resources. What about them? And it's something that I've been constantly been talking to Dan and the ACS board as well, because I also belong to Latinos contra el Cáncer. I'm saying, guys, we need to educate these individuals. We need to make sure they understand that the resources of support is there, because they don't have the proper insurance. They don't have the economical and emotional support. If my mother did not have me to help her navigate, to identify a doctor, to go through the cancer treatments, to take her to the chemo, the radiation, who is she going to resort to? Who is she going to rely on? So you had somebody, Tracie. My mother had me, so, but what about those individuals who are navigating through this alone? What about them? How do they know what to reach out to, where to reach out to, who to reach out to? So there's a lot of moving parts in this, and we can keep talking about this for a long time. But Dr. Goffney, any thoughts on this, what we have been discussing now?
Sure. Well, thank you for that story, Tracie. I'm sorry you had that experience. That I don't believe is typical, and certainly there are some people who are referred to the wrong person up front. A lot of what we do in medicine has to do with interpersonal skills. We need to be able to certainly interact with our patients in a way that's not going to terrify them. I think a lot of doctors have developed that empathy and that ability to communicate in a way that doesn't leave a patient terrified. So I'm sorry you had that experience. We didn't hear the good side of that story, and maybe if we have more time at the end of this, you could tell us about what happened when you actually saw the breast specialist.
Yeah,
because it sounds like they were a lot more empathetic. You touched on a little bit, Tracie, I guess it's sort of probably a lack of time or lack of interest on the part of your initial surgeon. And I see that as a problem, particularly for under-resourced, under-insured people, because they might be in a network, whether it's Medi-Cal in California or Medicaid elsewhere, that forces them into almost it's an overburdened, overcrowded system. So it may force you to go see a doctor who actually doesn't have the interest, to maybe because he or she is overworked, or they don't have the time to discuss with you the various resources that you could seek out to help with your care. A lot of these very doctors may not have the time themselves to go on to the cancer.org or to the Cancer Information Service to see what trials are available, or see if you fit. And that generally means that you need a team. You need a medical oncologist if you have a malignancy, as well as a surgeon, as well as a primary care physician, and hopefully someone in that network will be able to explain to you that there are options for treatment and their clinical trials if you have some stage of disease that there may not be standard treatments for.
Because cancer runs in my family, there were other members of my family who were also diagnosed that perhaps weren't as fortunate. And Dr. Goffney, you touched on something that gets me, and that is resources and availability to resources. I am very familiar with cancer.org. As a Reach to Recovery volunteer, that is a resource that I recommend to newly diagnosed patients all the time. Not just that, but the 800 number for ACS as well. But I definitely recommend cancer.org. I tell them, go take a look around. There's a lot of information. Don't let that intimidate you. Just put what you need in the search box, click around, and find what you're looking for. But when it comes to thinking about diversity and resources, I also have a good friend who didn't have health insurance when she was diagnosed, and she had to go through LA County for her cancer treatment. And I understand that when you are not going through private insurance and you are using like the county resources, you are talking about an overburdened system. You are talking about a shortage of everything, starting with personnel all the way down to handle the workload. And you're talking about restrictions placed on them by Medi-Cal, Medicaid,
Yeah.
whatever, as to what they can do, what they can't do, what will be reimbursed, what won't be reimbursed, and all of that. So when we start attacking this question about this issue of diversity, inclusion, and equity, and we start talking about that, it's such a big subject. You know, it's very hard to chunk it down.
Yeah.
Because you go back to it goes all the way back to the systemic racism in this country. It goes all the way back. There's almost impossible for at least the African American community to talk about our relationship with the medical community without the words Tuskegee study coming up.
Yeah.
All of that comes up, and it all plays into the distrust and the breakdown of communication between certain minority communities of color, as well as what Dr. Goffney said, generations. You know, there's generational issues that have to be addressed. And yes, at the time that I was diagnosed, I would guess I'd consider myself a young-ish-er person than I am.
You still
now.
are.
Oh, no. But I was a little younger, but the field that I was working in the fashion industry at the time, and I had to think about how I look. My appearance was important for what I was doing. So I did choose to go with a double mastectomy with reconstruction. And for me, again, I was fortunate that I had good health insurance. I worked through a very well-known cancer center within my insurance. So I was very, very fortunate there. But I was not unaware that everyone didn't have those options. When I had my reconstruction, they asked, do you want saline or do you want silicone? And I was like, I get a choice? Oh, okay. And so I made those choices. And then I was asking, well, they explained the different types of surgeries that I could get to me. I think one was called transflap. This is Dr. Goffney's area of expertise, not mine.
Yeah.
But there was that one, and they told me the benefits as well as the drawbacks. So I was very, very lucky. But at the same time, I had a family member going through cancer who also had good health insurance and was a nurse and a registered nurse. But her insurance at the hospital where she worked didn't offer all of the options that were out there and that were available.
I think it is true that you would receive more empathetic care, certainly, and possibly better care from someone who looks like you, because they do understand where you've come from in general, where you've come from.
Generally speaking, yes.
Right. And so, you know, that everything you've brought up really points out how there's a gap really in care for certainly African-American patients and other minority patients. You know, when you don't have enough doctors who look like you, even in your county, then the chances of you being able to see one are pretty low. And you're right when you say, certainly for the African-American community, we tend to not go in until things are in stage. And that's the problem. I think there's a perception that any cancer diagnosis is going to lead to death, when in reality, that's just not true. The American Cancer Society has been very successful promoting certain behaviors that lead to early diagnosis, and that leads to survivability.
Survival options, yes.
That's right. We're doing better and better, certainly in this country, with that. And African Americans especially, I think certainly the older African Americans have this fear of being experimented upon, and so they're more reluctant to go in. That's a problem. That's what keeps them out of clinical trials. But one of the things, if a clinical trial is even offered to them, they'd be less likely to enroll because they think they're just a subject of an experiment, and so that's a problem.
But they're not taking into account the advances that have been made in medicine and treatment between that. All they know is This person got a diagnosis and this person died. And they don't want that same thing. And no matter how much you try to say, yeah, you do understand that if you have cancer, it doesn't matter whether they tell you or not. The cancer doesn't know that you didn't tell anybody. So it's going to keep doing what it does.
Yeah.
So we need to get you in there. And it's you know, so there's a certain amount of education we have to do to our older population that's still with us. And, you know, that's a different type of education because, you know, younger people learn one way, older people learn a different. So that's going in there as well. So
That's right. So thank you so much for excellent information and feedback. We're speaking with Dr. Willie Goffney as well as Tracie Kimbrough. They're both advocates, ambassadors of American Cancer Society. Today, we're having a special edition of Candid Conversations with Adam Lopez and American Cancer Society, where we're talking about African-American perspectives on diversity in science as it relates to cancer. Excellent information regarding education, being informed, resources, support, empathy, anything that we can think of, which I think this is definitely going to provide a little bit of insightful information to those individuals beginning their journey and those that are still in the middle or lost or really just want answers or a little bit of guidance, which is, again, thank you both for being on the show today. Dr. Goffney, a very specific question for you, considering that you deal with patients as your career in your industry. Where do you think exist gaps? Have they existed? Do they still exist when in regards to African-American cancer patients?
Well, we've touched on it already. Certainly there is a gap in medical literacy that we need to work on. That's sort of across the board, but I think the gap is larger in minority communities in general. There is a gap also in terms of finding a provider who looks like you. I mean,
that's right.
That's valuable because the communication aspect, I think, is easier to accomplish if you're talking to someone who may have had similar experiences growing up that you're as a patient have had. They may understand some of the inherent fears that may have been passed down from generation to generation, preventing certain treatments. There, of course, are huge gaps in the numbers of minority physicians available, certainly Black males in medicine. Our percentage has actually gone down over the last 30 years in medicine. And if you look at the percentage of Black doctors in this country, it hasn't really improved in the last 100 years. So there are huge problems there. And then that leads to the big gaps in how we treat. We talked already about gaps in insurance coverage and the importance of having good insurance. If you're in a system, I keep, I guess, beating up on Medi-Cal and Medicaid across this country because they do provide some care, but they generally force you into a network where the doctors are underpaid. Most of the people who are providing the care are underpaid, and they end up with just huge numbers of patients, both on the hospital side and the doctor side, and they really can't provide adequate care, in my view, to the great majority of patients. They certainly can't provide that empathetic care that's so important in terms of helping a patient to do better.
Great information from Dr. Goffney. Thank you for sharing your insight and input on the gaps that exist. Tracie, a question for you as a cancer survivor. What role has American Cancer Society played to support you and others that you may know in the African-American community to improve participation in research, both as patients and maybe in scientific leadership as well?
Well, first of all, I think the most important one is their willingness to support and their willingness to accept, acknowledge, and make changes to improve their reach and their outreach to the African American as well as other minority communities of color. So that's a huge support. There is that I'm going to start with that because that's important, and that doesn't always happen. It doesn't always happen.
Yeah.
So I think that's very, very important, and that they recognize the importance of reaching out to communities of color. They recognize the difference in the numbers of patients, the survival rates, all of it, that they recognize the whole thing across the board. That is a wonderful comfort to me as a survivor. Also, the fact that they're there. And this I know it's as an African American person, but basically just as a cancer survivor, the fact that they're there and the information that they provide can be trusted, because all information isn't good information. You
Yeah.
have to evaluate the source you're going to for your information as critically as you are looking at the actual information itself. So knowing that I could go to the American Cancer Society and ask questions, knowing that there is an 800 number there that I can go to it anytime I have a question, knowing that cancer.org, the website is there, and I can search on there and look for information. That's basically that's the support for me. There's other programs that they have that they understand that cancer isn't just about the malignancy of the tumor. It's not just about that. It's also about look good, feel better. It's also about how I feel afterwards. It's also about helping me regain my femininity and feeling womanly again. And that can come through look good, feel better. It can also, they support me by pairing me with someone in Reach to Recovery. Very often, as a Reach to Recovery volunteer, I'm one of very few African American Reach to Recovery volunteers. And so I'm often paired with other African Americans who are newly diagnosed, because they want to talk to someone that's as much like them and understands their experience, their culture as possible. And that makes sense. So having ACS recognize that and support it and push it, that's made all the difference for me.
Well said, Tracie, and thank you so much for that inside information. And you're right. I think the ongoing support, right, the ongoing is very important. You said you were right on, so thank you for sharing that. You've been watching another episode of A Candid Conversation with Adam Lopez, with a special episode, American Cancer Society, talking about diversity in science as it relates to cancer within the African American community, minorities, and underserved and underprivileged as well. Dr. Goffney, the last question, it goes to you here. Where do you think opportunities exist for greater diversity in cancer leadership? Are you hearing anything, or do you have any ideas for improvements as well?
Well, diversity can be looked at in different ways. I think certainly the male to female ratios will change, just because there are more women in medical schools now than men, and pretty soon this field will be dominated by women. And I've thought that way for the last 20 years. That's fine. And so that's one form of diversity, just the male female. In terms of the white to black or white to minority ratios, we have a lot of work to do, because as I mentioned before, well, first of all, leadership in cancer care generally comes from the medical community. Sometimes I should say medical and scientific community. But the pipeline issues I've already brought up are still going to hold us back in terms of producing more Black and brown doctors who might then go on to become leaders in cancer care. If they existed. In the same way, you don't have as many Black and brown scientists who could go on to become leaders for the same pipeline issues that I've already spoken about. We just have to do a better job starting early, I think, with people, exposing them to certain areas of medicine and science that will go on and will help them to go on to become, a leader in the field.
Thank you for sharing that. We've been speaking with Tracie Kimbrough and Dr. Willie Goffney, who are not only volunteers, ambassadors, but also advocates of the American Cancer Society, the minority communities, underserved and underprivileged communities as well. I firmly believe that we're doing here is great, that we're not only providing our experiences, but we're going to help somebody navigate through this roller coaster of emotions. Because, looking at my mother with her 2 times having cancer, it was not only emotionally draining, but financially, physically, all aspects of it. It just really drained her, right? And the thing is that as a woman, and I'm gonna talk about women because my mother had suffered, breast cancer and then bladder cancer. It's just demeaning in nature. Tracie, you talked about sitting there looking like it was a tic-tac-toe, removing your breast. It's as a woman, like that you shouldn't be going. That's not normal. You shouldn't be going through that. It's demeaning in nature, right? So, and then you go through all those emotions, then to not have the empathy from the doctor to add on top of that. It's just a roller coaster that you go through. To have the support of your family, friends, having people there with you is very important, but also having the proper doctor. So it's just, we can take another hour speaking about the other elements of the support and all that. But I wanted to thank you both, Dr. William Goffney, Tracie Rubina on the program. I want to thank you, Tracie, for sharing your personal story of what you went through. You're a cancer survivor. You're a hero. You can definitely share your testimony with many. Dr. Goffney, you have a lot of inside information about the disparities with the patients, the lack of the gaps, the opportunities. So there's just so much we can talk about. And I want to give you each 30 seconds to just give your positive message to that person who's going to be watching or listening to this, who's going to starting their journey. Just 30 seconds of a positive message of what you want to tell them based on your experience. Dr. Goffney, I'll go with you first.
Well, having a cancer diagnosis does not mean that you're going to die. The earlier we find cancer, the better off you're going to do. My job as a surgeon is easier, and your outcome as a patient is better. It's better cosmetically. It's better in terms of your longevity. And so I say to people, go get screened. Don't skip them. That mammogram is important. That colonoscopy is important. That PSA, with the consultation from your doctor is important. If you've been a smoker, low dose CT screening is important. And so, we all can do our part in to help live long, have more birthdays. That was one of our slogans once upon a time. I think it was very apropos, have more birthdays.
Thank you so much, Dr. Goffney. Tracie.
I want to let anyone know, first of all, early detection is key. That's it. Early detection is key for your survival. Get your screenings today. If you haven't made your appointment, today is a good day. Call and make that appointment. And if you need help and support, please check out cancer.org or the American Cancer Society's website, or call them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year at 1-800-ACS-2345. That's 1-800-ACS-2345. Get screened today.
Well said. You've been watching another episode of A Candid Conversation with Adam Lopez. I'm your host, Adam, with a special edition of the American Cancer Society, African-American perspectives on diversity and science as it relates to cancer. All the information is going to be down on your screen. I'm going to put Tracie's information, Dr. Goffney's information. If you ever want to reach out to us, all of the American Cancer Society website, phone numbers, it will all be on the bottom of your screen. I want to thank you both so much for your time. Thank you so much for sharing your life experiences, your journey, everything that you have to offer just to help that one person who's going to watch this and listen to this. So thank you so much and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you.